Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. With Robert Eggers Nosferatu hitting theaters, vampires are everywhere right now. But before Bram Stoker's Dracula, before Hollywood vampires, there was something far more terrifying. A real vampire panic that gripped the Austrian Empire in the 1700s. This wasn't fiction. This was mass hysteria, primitive forensic science, and genuine fear that turned entire villages upside down. So grab your garlic and wooden stakes, because today we're diving deep into the great vampire epidemic of the 18th century. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1700s, and the Austrian Empire is massive, stretching across Central and Eastern Europe. We're talking modern-day Austria, Hungary, parts of Serbia, Romania, and beyond. The empire has just finished a brutal war with the Ottoman Empire, the Great Turkish War, which ended in 1699. This war left the border regions devastated. Villages were destroyed, populations displaced, and disease was rampant. The Austrian Empire gained new territories, particularly in Serbia and Wallachia, regions that would soon become ground zero for vampire panic. These newly acquired territories were rural, isolated, and filled with superstitious beliefs that had been passed down for generations. The stage was set for something unusual. The panic didn't start overnight. It began with whispers, strange deaths, mysterious illnesses, and terrified villagers. In the 1720s, reports started filtering back to Vienna about unusual occurrences in Serbian villages. People were dying mysteriously, and the locals had an explanation: vampires. Now, the word they used wasn't quite vampire. The Serbian term was vampir or upir, meaning something that rises from the grave to feed on the living. But what made this different from typical folklore was that Austrian officials actually took these reports seriously enough to investigate. Military physicians and government officials were sent to these villages to document what was happening. And what they documented would send shockwaves through European intellectual circles. Let's talk about our first major documented case, Peter Plogojowitz. In 1725, in the village of Kiselova, in Serbian Banat, a peasant named Peter Plogojowitz died. Nothing unusual there, right? But within 8 days, 9 people in the village also died, all suddenly. All after brief illnesses lasting only 24 hours. The villagers were terrified. Several of the dying claimed that Peter Plogojowitz had visited them in the night, lying on top of them and suffocating them. His own widow claimed he had returned asking for his shoes. The entire village was convinced Peter Plogojowitz had become a vampire. The local priest and Austrian officials were pressured to act. They assembled a group and went to Peter Plogojowitz's grave. What they found was documented in an official report that still exists today. According to the imperial provisor Frambald, who witnessed the exhumation, Peter Plogojowitz's body showed no signs of decomposition. His skin hadn't decayed, new skin and nails appeared to be growing. His hair and beard seemed longer, and there was fresh blood in his mouth. The villagers demanded action. Following local custom, they drove a stake through the corpse's heart. The report states that fresh blood flowed from the wound and from his ears and mouth. Then they burned the body to ashes. But the case that really put vampire panic on the map was Arnold Paole. This is the big one, folks. The case that generated the most documentation and caused the most widespread fear. It happened in the village of Medvega, near Belgrade. Starting in 1726, Arnold Paole was a former soldier who had returned to his village after serving on the Ottoman frontier. He told people a strange story, that while he was stationed in Turkish Serbia, he had been plagued by a vampire. To cure himself, he claimed he had eaten soil from the vampire's grave and smeared himself with the vampire's blood. Yeah, you heard that right. That was apparently the folk remedy. But Paole seemed anxious about it, telling his fiancée that he didn't think the cure had worked. In 1726, Arnold Paole died in a hay wagon accident, a broken neck. He was buried, and that should have been the end of it. But within a month, 4 people in the village died suddenly. All 4 had claimed, before their deaths, that they had been plagued by Arnold Paole's ghost. The villagers exhumed Arnold Paole's body 40 days after his burial. What they reported finding was shocking. The body hadn't decomposed. Blood flowed from the eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. The shirt and shroud were soaked in blood. Old skin and nails had fallen away with new ones growing underneath. And the body appeared to be in a vampire state. Following tradition, they drove a stake through the heart. Witnesses reported that the corpse groaned and bled profusely when staked. Then they burned the body. They also exhumed and burned the bodies of the 4 people who had died after Paole, believing they too had become vampires. The village thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong. 5 years later, in 1731, it happened again. Between December 1731 and January 1732, 17 people in Medvega died under similar mysterious circumstances. The village was in complete panic. People were dying, and the old fear returned. Vampires were among them. This time, the Austrian authorities decided they needed a proper investigation. They sent a team of military surgeons and officers to conduct a thorough examination. This wasn't going to be village superstition anymore. This was going to be science. The team was led by regimental field surgeon Johannes Flückinger and included 5 other military surgeons. They arrived in January 1732 with orders to investigate thoroughly and document everything. What followed was an extraordinary series of autopsies. Flückinger and his team exhumed and examined dozens of bodies, documenting each one in meticulous detail. Their report, called the Visium et Repertam, Latin for seen and discovered, is one of the most detailed documents we have from this vampire panic. Let me give you some examples from their report. They exhumed a woman named Stanna, aged 20, who had died in childbirth 3 months earlier. The report states her body was completely fresh, the skin was colored, and healthy hair and nails were fresh, and when they opened the chest cavity, they found the heart and blood vessels full of fresh extravascular blood, meaning blood outside the vessels. Another case, Melisa, a 60-year-old woman who had died after a 3-month illness. Her body was described as completely fresh and undecayed. When they opened her, they found the same thing, organs full of fresh blood. They examined case after case, finding similar results. Bodies that should have been in various stages of decomposition appeared fresh. Blood that should have been dried up was still liquid. The surgeons were documenting something they couldn't explain. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These weren't ignorant peasants. These were trained military surgeons, educated men who knew anatomy. So why did they believe they were seeing vampires? The answer is, they didn't understand decomposition. In the 1700s, forensic pathology didn't exist as we know it. They didn't know that decomposition rates vary wildly depending on soil conditions, temperature, burial depth, and how the person died. Bodies buried in cold, dry soil can remain preserved for months. Bodies buried in certain clay soils can be naturally mummified. And here's the kicker. When gases build up during decomposition, they can force blood and fluids out of the mouth and nose. This looks exactly like fresh blood to someone who doesn't understand the process. The new skin and nails, that's just the old skin sloughing off, making the underlying tissue visible. It's not actually growing. The groaning, when staked, that's gas escaping from the lungs when the body is punctured. Everything they interpreted as signs of vampirism had natural explanations, but they didn't know that yet. Flückinger's report reached Vienna in early 1732, and it caused a sensation. Remember, this was the age of enlightenment. Reason and science were supposed to be replacing superstition. Yet here was an official military document, signed by multiple surgeons, describing what appeared to be vampires. The report was quickly published and distributed throughout Europe. It appeared in newspapers, medical journals, and was translated into multiple languages. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the Serbian vampires. The case sparked enormous debate. Some intellectuals argued this proved supernatural phenomena were real. Others searched for rational explanations. The vampire panic became one of the first major intersections between folklore, medicine, and Enlightenment skepticism. The vampire panic attracted attention from some of the greatest minds in Europe. In 1733, a French Benedictine monk named Dom Augustin Calmet published a massive treatise called Traits sur les apparitions, a scholarly investigation of ghosts, demons, and vampires. Calmet took the reports seriously and tried to find rational explanations. He suggested premature burial, that some of these vampires might have been people buried alive who then died in their coffins. It was a horrifying but more rational explanation than the supernatural. Other scholars jumped in. The Italian scientist Giuseppe Davanzati wrote Dissertazione sopra I vampiri in 1744, arguing the whole thing was superstition and misunderstood natural phenomena. German theologian Michael Ranft published Domesticatio Mortuorum in 1728, exploring the chewing dead, another related folklore phenomenon. But here's what's fascinating. Even the skeptics couldn't entirely dismiss the reports. The documentation was too official, the witnesses too credible. It created genuine scientific uncertainty. The panic wasn't contained to Serbia. Throughout the 1730s and 1740s, vampire reports erupted across the Austrian Empire and beyond. Cases were documented in Hungary, Moravia, Silesia, and Poland. In 1732, the same year as the second Medvega investigation, 11 more vampire cases were reported in Hungarian villages. In East Prussia, in 1732, there were mass exhumations. The Austrian government was receiving so many reports that they had to establish official policies for dealing with suspected vampires. Empress Maria Theresa, who ruled from 1740 to 1780, eventually had to step in. She sent her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate. Van Swieten was a rationalist who didn't believe in vampires, but he had to take the reports seriously because they were causing real problems. Villagers were digging up cemeteries, destroying bodies, and spreading disease in the process. Gerard van Swieten conducted his investigation in the 1750s and concluded that the vampire reports were based on misunderstanding of natural decomposition processes and mass hysteria. He wrote a report to the Empress arguing that the exhumations themselves were spreading disease and that the practice needed to stop. In 1755, Maria Theresa issued an imperial decree forbidding the opening of graves and desecration of bodies without official permission. The decree didn't say vampires weren't real. Politically, she couldn't quite do that. But it effectively ended the practice of vampire hunting in the Austrian Empire. Local officials were instructed to report suspected vampire cases to Vienna, where medical authorities would evaluate them. In practice, this meant the reports were filed away and ignored. The age of reason had finally caught up with the vampire panic. So why did this vampire epidemic happen when it did? It was really a perfect storm of factors coming together. First, you had the aftermath of the Great Turkish War. Regions that had been under Ottoman control were now under Austrian control. There was massive displacement, trauma, and disease. People were dying in unusual numbers. Second, you had a clash of cultures. Serbian Orthodox traditions included beliefs about the undead that were foreign to Austrian Catholic officials. But instead of dismissing them outright, the officials documented them, giving them legitimacy. Third, primitive medical knowledge. Even educated physicians didn't understand decomposition. They were seeing real phenomena, preserved bodies, blood in corpses, but interpreting them through the only framework they had. Fourth, mass hysteria. Once the panic started, it fed on itself. Every unexplained death became a vampire. Every nightmare became a visitation. Fear is contagious. And finally, this was the early Enlightenment. People were caught between the old world of superstition and the new world of reason. They wanted to believe in science, but they didn't yet have the tools to fully understand what they were seeing. The 18th century vampire panic had enormous cultural impact. This is where our modern concept of the vampire really begins. Not in Transylvania with Dracula, but in Serbian villages with Arnold Paole. The panic inspired a wave of vampire literature. Before this, vampires in folklore were mostly bloated, plague-spreading corpses. But the 18th century reports introduced new elements. The vampire as a recently deceased person. The idea of vampire contagion, the specific methods of destruction. These reports directly influenced John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, the first vampire story in English. They influenced Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872. And yes, they influenced Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Stoker researched Eastern European folklore extensively. The wooden stake, the need to burn the body, the idea that vampires create other vampires. These all come from the documented cases of the 1720s and 1730s. The vampire panic gave us the blueprint for every vampire story that followed. From a modern perspective, we can explain everything they witnessed. The fresh corpses, variable decomposition rates based on environmental conditions, the new skin and nails, normal sloughing of outer tissue layers, the blood in the mouth, either actual blood from the dying process or decomposition fluids forced up by gas pressure. Some of the vampires might have been victims of premature burial. People buried in comas or cataleptic states who woke up in their coffins. The evidence of movement in the grave, the position of bodies, these could indicate someone who was buried alive. That's actually more horrifying than vampires when you think about it. Others might have been victims of infectious diseases like tuberculosis or plague that were then spreading to family members. The progression of illness through a household would look like vampire contagion if you didn't understand germ theory. But let's not forget, this wasn't just an intellectual curiosity. Real people's lives were destroyed by this panic. Bodies were desecrated. Families were traumatized. Grieving widows watched their husbands' corpses staked and burned. The widow of Arnold Paole had to watch her dead husband, who died in an accident, be declared a vampire and burned. The families of the victims had to process their grief while also fearing that their loved ones might rise from the dead. Villages were torn apart by suspicion. If you died suddenly, would you become a vampire? Would your neighbors dig you up? The psychological trauma was real and widespread. So what can we learn from the great vampire epidemic of the 1700s? I think it teaches us several things. First, fear is powerful. It can make educated people believe extraordinary things. The surgeons who examined Arnold Paole weren't stupid, they just didn't have the right framework to understand what they were seeing. Second, documentation matters. We know about these cases in such detail because officials took them seriously enough to write everything down. Those reports allow us to understand what really happened. Third, the line between folklore and fact is blurrier than we think. The vampire panic happened because real phenomena, decomposition, disease, premature burial, intersected with cultural beliefs about the undead. Neither element alone would have caused the panic. And finally, it reminds us that every monster story comes from somewhere. When you watch Nosferatu this year, remember Arnold Paole. Remember Peter Plogojowitz. Remember the terrified villages of 18th century Serbia. The vampire we see on screen has roots in real fear, real panic, and real tragedy. So there you have it. The real vampire panic that scared the Austrian Empire. From the villages of Serbia to the courts of Vienna, from mass exhumations to Empress Maria Theresa's decree. This is where the modern vampire was born. What do you think? Does knowing the real history make vampires more or less scary? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, give this video a like and subscribe for more historical deep dives into the stories behind our favorite myths and legends. Thanks for watching, and remember, always check your loved ones' graves. Just kidding, or am I? See you next time.